fin, perfectly stepped, not one error, and upon conclusion of this perfect minuet, what did the queen say to you? C'est magnifique. It is magnificent. And you know very well she never gave compliments to anyone but herself. Oh, madame, if only we had a few musicians present, we could all see an example of that minuet. Would you like that, my friends?
General Lafayette.
There's not supposed to be one musician present. Perhaps another time. Oh, don't worry, the Chevalier was a horrible dancer. Well, forgive me, I have veered off the course of my story. But in the course of that evening, as we spoke of the Declaration of Independence, of the members of your Congress, and about the great man himself, General Washington, I was so inspired by this cause that I told my brother officers that I was ready and willing to put my colors to this great and glorious cause. Now, many have said to me, why, Monsieur Marquis? Why would you want to go and fight and perhaps die in another man's war? For France and England were not at war at that moment. Why would you want to risk yourself in such an endeavor? Well, I think you know the answer to that question. For this truly had been a war like none other in the history of man. Had it not? A war of great ideas, of the freedom, even the liberation of mankind. A war that had embraced the ideas of the great thinkers of this, well, enlightened age. This age of reason, with men like Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu. These men believed that a man, no matter what station in life he might be born, whether he be black or white, Catholic or Protestant, rich or poor, slave or free, should not make a difference, but simply by the way in which that person would carry themselves and prove themselves in this world. My dear friends, after these more than 40 long years, are you still in agreement with these great ideas? Well, I am pleased to hear that so thus began my crusade to take part in this war. Now, at first I was denied by my commander to take part in such an expedition, but I thought if I simply go to Versailles and speak with the King and Queen of France, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, perhaps they might permit me to go. So off I go to Versailles, presenting myself at court, asking the King and Queen if I might go to America. Well, what do they say to me? Exactly. Just remember that everyone must say no to the Marquis at least once. Oh, je regrette, Monsieur le Marquis, cela n'est pas possible, c'est un moment rare quand la France et l'Angleterre ne sont pas en guerre, et je ne souhaite pas pour vous de penser une. I'm sorry, Monsieur le Marquis, it is just not possible. For it is indeed a rare time in French history where France and England are not at war. And I do not wish for you to start yet another war with that horrible nation of merchants. Well, my friends, that should have been the end of it. For when the King and Queen of France say you cannot go, you cannot. But I did the unthinkable. I disobeyed. I left my regiment. I went to the western part of France, and there at the port city of Bordeaux, I purchased a ship fittingly called La Victoire, the Victory. A three-masted ship, a cargo ship to be sure, but it would take me across the Atlantic. Well, of course, the King and Queen soon found out that I, the Marquis de Lafayette, had disobeyed them, and, well, do you think they were pleased with this? No. Au contraire, they were quite displeased with me. In fact, so much so, they sent out the gendarmerie, soldiers, anyone who could apprehend me, for if I was to be apprehended, of course I was to return back to my regiment at Metz, or worse, my father-in-law at Marseille. So I had to act with the utmost secrecy, preparing all that I would need. A crew to man my ship, companions to join me, all of the supplies that I would need, for in truth, I did not know when, or if I would even return back to France. Well, when all was prepared, the harbour master at Bordeaux inquired, "What is your destination, monsieur? Where are you headed?" Not realizing, of course, at that moment that I was the Marquis de Lafayette, for of course I had disguised myself. And, madame, if you had to disguise yourself, and you wanted no one to know it was you, what exactly might you wear? This. You've not had that that response before. Well, interesting. So you were dressed as the Marquis de Lafayette, even though you did not want them to know the Marquis de Lafayette. Oh, I see. It is for you. Excellent. I had to think twice about that. An excellent idea, madame. Applaud her for her response, dear friend. Well, madame, the English newspapers reported that I, the Marquis de Lafayette, disguised myself, are you ready for this? Yes. In a woman's gown. Now, can you imagine? Well, don't imagine that. Oh, do not believe everything you read or hear, especially if it is written by an Englishman about a Frenchman. Madame, I disguised myself as a merchant, there to take part in a bit of commerce with the people of Spain, so not having any issue with this, they of course allowed me to pass, and true to my word, I went from France to Spain, but what would be my ultimate destination? America. Now, of course, this journey took me 8 long weeks, in which I was seasick nearly every day of my journey. I landed in South Carolina, most notably Georgetown, South Carolina. I had to make my way all the way northward to Philadelphia City, for I had in my possession something called a promissory note given to me by an American agent in Paris by the name of Silas Dean. And as the name implies, it promised that if I, the Marquis de Lafayette, was to come to America, I would be granted the rank of Major General in the Continental Army. Now, not that Silas Dean thought I was the next Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Julius Caesar, and at present time King Frederick II of Prussia, but he knew that I had connections at court with the king. Little did he know that I disobeyed the king. But nonetheless, my friends, I had this promissory note, and I made my way to Philadelphia City, and I presented myself before Congress. And there I said to them, kindly honor me so, by granting me a command in the Continental Army, that I too might fight alongside General Washington and fight for American freedom. And what do they say to me? Bravo, you're learning quickly. They say, thank you for coming, Monsieur le Marquis. We appreciate you offering your services, but we don't need or even want your help. Now, can you imagine this? Indeed, so many foreign officers had come, and unfortunately, many of them did not have the experience that they had said. Can you imagine? They lied. Indeed, I was towards the end of a long list of foreign officers that had come, not just Frenchmen, but those of the German states. Some Englishmen, some Italians had come, and some Poles had come, but many of them did not have experience. So, of course, you see the approach of a 19-year-old French aristocrat. Are you going to tell him that, yes, we'll make you a general? Well, they told me to go home, but I was not ready to go home. I was not willing to go home. I wanted to fight in this glorious cause, so I tried again, saying, very well, you will not give me a command of soldiers, but just perhaps you might make me an aide-de-camp to General Washington, an assistant to the great man. Yet again they say to me, I'm sorry, Monsieur le Marquis, but once again, this is just not possible. Besides, we don't have enough money to pay you. Well, my friends, I finally said boldly to your members of Congress, then I shall serve at my own expense. And would you know it, with those immortal words, your Congress immediately made me a general. I could not imagine my good fortune, for as I mentioned, I was but a captain in the French army, and a newly promoted one. But here in America, I was made a Major General, a General of Division. I could command upwards of 5,000 soldiers. Yet I never commanded more than 50 in my entire life. And it was all at the age of 19. Well, I had the great opportunity to meet His Excellency General Washington that very next evening, for the people of Philadelphia were holding a ball for General Washington, a party. You know all about parties, don't you, madame? But this one held in honor of General Washington for defending the city of brotherly love. Now, I recall when he walked into the room, for I knew exactly who he was before he spoke, even though we had never met before, for it was simply by the way in which he carried himself. For to me, he was truly an aristocrat without the name, a nobleman without the title. He came forth, he held out his hand, he said to me, I thank you, Monsieur le Marquis, for coming to support this cause. Think of this new place as your new home. Think of the officers around you as your new family. And think of me as your new friend. And with this, of course, I could not help myself. I immediately embraced him. I think I might have embarrassed him a little bit with my French custom. But I said to him, from now on, mon général, j'ai deux patries, la France et les États-Unis d'Amérique. From now on, I shall have two countries, France and the United States of America. And thus, the great adventure had truly begun. I would, of course, take part in my first engagement at Brandywine. I was wounded, nearly killed in that engagement. I would be nursed back to health by the lovely girls of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I would go to the winter encampment at Valley Forge. I would take part in the engagements at Gloucester, at Barron Hill, at Monmouth Courthouse. I would eventually go up to Rhode Island and take part in that great engagement there, eventually returning back to France to explain myself to the king. But upon my return, I would assume command of the newly formed Light Infantry Division. And I would be dispatched right here to Virginia, to Williamsburg even for a time, in which I fought my cat-and-mouse campaign against Lord Cornwallis, which would of course culminate at Yorktown. Now friends, there at Yorktown we had won the greatest victory in the war. And General Washington had told me that I had played a great part in that campaign and throughout the war. And that is the greatest honor he could have given me. That I did something positive for the American people and for winning this war. I had to return back to France, but of course upon the conclusion of the war in 1784, I immediately returned, in which I could celebrate with all of you. But I soon discovered that even with this Treaty of Paris, even though America had achieved her independence, the revolution was incomplete, wasn't it? For your Declaration of Independence stated that all men are created equal, that all should be welcome under the banner of American freedom, no matter who their parents are, the color of their skin, or how much money they have within their pocket, but simply by what they can do and offer to this nation. So I wrote a letter to General Washington stating that you would be an even greater man than you already are, mon général, if you would set the example by emancipating the slaves, thereby welcome them as productive members of society under the flag of American freedom, and you could move on to be this great nation. Unfortunately, General Washington responded with, firstly, I am a credit to humanity, he said, which I thought was kind. But he said it could not be done. He said a revolt on par with that of the great Spartacus of the 1st century BC. Of course, this did not sit well with me, so I endeavored to perhaps set the example myself. So my beloved wife, Adrienne, and myself were able to purchase some land in French Guiana in 1785, and we purchased upward of 70 slaves. We granted them their freedom. We provided them with supplies, tools, things that they might need to establish a colony, and what occurred? They prospered. They were successful. So by this example, we knew that it could be achieved, if only others would be willing to do so. Indeed, I had lent my name, my voice, my right arm, my purse, everything I possibly could to any organization that was looking towards the end of slavery. But there was one such individual that was put in my service in the course of the 1781 campaign. His name was James Armistead, a slave. His master, William Armistead, was the head of the public stores here in Virginia. And upon my arrival, his master put James in my service to do with as I wished, to be a valet de chambre, to be a palefrenier, whatever it might be. But after having a conversation with James, I discovered that he was quite an intelligent man. And I risked the thought that perhaps James could make his way into the enemy encampment and serve as a spy, serving in the same exact capacity that he was serving me, and thereby extract information, bring it to me, that could ultimately bring us success in the course of the war. Well, this was a great risk to ask of anyone. For if you are a spy captured in time of war, what is the penalty? Death immediately. And yet the English were promising freedom to the slaves who left their rebel masters. Dunmore's proclamation of November 1775 and the Philipsburg proclamation of 1780, all promising freedom to the Negro. So all he really needed to do was to cross the lines and there find his freedom. But it's never so simple, is it? There were other factors to include his family, his wife. And so had he left, well, of course he would probably never see her again. So thus he thought about this. Well, I can't really trust the English. They brought me here in the first place, he said. I can't really trust the Americans, for even though their document, the Declaration of Independence, states that all men are created equal, a large portion of the population is still enslaved. He said, but I can trust you, Monsieur le Marquis, that you will do everything within your power to bring about my freedom as a result of serving. So upon the conclusion of the war, there was a promise made by the Virginia legislature, as well as other legislatures in the 13 United States, that you would be granted your freedom if you were a slave and served in the Continental Army. But because James served as a spy, they felt he had not really served. Can you imagine? Well, of course, upon my return, I was livid, and I wrote a strongly worded letter to the Virginia legislature. It was dated the 21st day of November of 1784, and it was simply titled, "A Recommendation for James." This is to certify that the bearer of this letter, by the name of James, has done essential service to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligence from the enemy's camps were industriously collected and most faithfully delivered. He perfectly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him, and appears to me entitled to every reward a situation can admit of, done in my hand, 21 November 1784. Well, I returned back to France, of course, at the end of 84 and 85, and I soon discovered that James, even with this letter, was still enslaved. 1785 would pass. 1786, it would be at the beginning of 1787, February of that year, that finally James was granted his freedom. And to honor me, he changed his name from his slave name of James Armistead to his free name, James Lafayette. Well, of course, the revolution was upon the horizon in France. And of course, there is no one cause for any revolution, to include your American Revolution. And the French Revolution was coming along throughout the entirety of the 18th century. In fact, many like to reflect upon the reign of Louis XIV, Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, Louis XIV. And at the end of his reign in 17 and 15, unfortunately, France was not in a good state. The first 3 quarters of his reign were quite successful. Indeed, France was rather prosperous, but unfortunately, he is often remembered for the last quarter of his reign, which ended in 17 and 15. And so upon his death, the new king that inherited the throne was named Louis XV, Louis XV. He is what we like to call in France, a bon vivant. A bon vivant is someone who likes to have a good time, all the time. Now that's not good for any of us, but certainly not if you are the king of France. And he had France involved in a great many wars, most of them unsuccessful. He spent a great deal of money on building campaigns and parties. So by the time the king, at the time of the American Revolution, Louis XVI, inherited the throne, France's treasury was nearly empty. Yet in the course of the American Revolution, France would spend more money on this war than the Americans did. So it is no wonder that in those interwar years, from 1783 to 1789, when the French Revolution began, that an economic crisis rose up. Change needed to be brought to France. An absolute monarchy was in place, in which the king ruled absolutely. There were no checks and balances of a legislative body, like your Congress or like the English Parliament, but rather, for the most part, what the king said was done. Now, some might say, well, what of the Assembly of Notables? That is a legislative body. It is true, but they are all appointed by the king. So they tell him exactly what he wants to hear and not what he needs to hear. Some might say, well, what of the Estate General? True, but that legislative body had not been called up since 1614. The year was 1789. I ask you a simple question. Is that an effective legislative body? It certainly is not. Something new needed to be established. So, with my dear friend, who had been appointed to ambassador to France, Thomas Jefferson, the writer of your Declaration of Independence, he assisted me in writing a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And indeed, this would be the preamble for the French Constitution, in which we would change from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, in which I felt, and many throughout France, that we would have the best of both worlds. A king as the chief executive that many of the people of France were so comfortable with, since Vercingetorix united the tribes of Gaul in the 1st century BC, to Charlemagne in 800 AD, to all of the kings of France, but now we would have elected representatives of the people in the form of the Assemblée Nationale, the National Assembly of these elected representatives. And by the 6th of October, oddly enough, the day that Thomas Jefferson boarded his ship to return back to the Americas, this was adopted by the king. A constitutional monarchy had been put in place. Well, friends, that was all the way back in 1789. And here we are in 1824. We have all faced trials and tribulations, have we not? But we have endured. I think to America, all that you have endured. And how is it possible to have gone from 13 to 24 United States? You have endured war, civil strife, and turmoil, yet you have remained. I believe that is because of the foundation that was built at the price of so much sacrifice and blood by you, the American patriots. In fact, I dare say that one day this nation shall serve as a beacon for all other nations throughout the world as the truest example of freedom and independence. Now in France, our revolution is incomplete as well, but I, the Marquis de Lafayette, shall continue until my dying day to fight for the rights of mankind, wherever they are in need of assistance. Before my late wife passed in 1807, I would say all who came to our house at La Grange, that the door shall never be locked, it shall always be open for you, no matter who you are, if you are in need of help in fighting for the rights of mankind. I call myself an optimist. I call myself someone who tries to see the best of all, whether they be people or situations. And in this case, the world in which we live in, I shall remain optimistic. Step forward to try to fight for these rights of mankind, to make it a better world in which to live. God bless you all, and this great nation of the United States of America. So kind as to come and visit with me today, I am hopeful that some of you have brought some questions with you. Questions or queries of my life, of the past, present, and as always, hopes for the future. Mademoiselle with the beautiful gown that would be at home at the court at Versailles.
How are you related to Lafayette?
Indeed, what an interesting question the young lady asks. She says, how am I related to Lafayette? I have a surprise for you. I am Lafayette. My name is Marie-Joseph Polivrot-Schulbert-Mortier, the Marquis de Lafayette, indeed, of the great Lafayette family. My father, unfortunately, killed at the Battle of Minden, August the 1st of 1759, and my mother passed on when I was 13, of the Rivière family. But indeed, I prosper, I am well, even though I am 67 years of age. I am well enough, I hope, for at least another 10 years. Other questions? Yes, monsieur.
How did you learn such fluent English?
Monsieur asked the question in regards to my knowledge of the English language. Well, in truth, in the 18th century, prior to my arrival here in the Americas, what was the language of diplomacy? French, absolutely. Yes, it was the expectation that every diplomat, ambassador, officer, no matter what nation you came from, was expected to learn the French language, so you could all speak in a common tongue. But knowing that my country, France, was almost perpetually at war with England, and knowing those English officers did not always study their French verbs, many Frenchmen began learning a little English. We would never tell them that, though, of course. But when I decided to come to America, I jokingly say, though it was not funny at the time, that my best English lessons were in between bouts of seasickness on board the ship La Victoire with my dear friend Baron de Cole. For his native home was in Bavaria, in the German states of the Holy Roman Empire, what was then the Holy Roman Empire. But he was fluent in German, in French, and in English as well. So if you look at my timeline, monsieur, of arriving in America in June of 1777, landing in South Carolina, the vast majority of Americans do not speak French. So when I went from South Carolina all the way to Philadelphia, of course, I had to work on my English as best as I possibly could if I wanted to be understood. And I also realized that if I was to receive a commission in the American Army, I needed to know the language of command. So thus, I worked on my English as best as possible. So when I meet General Washington at City Tavern, the last day of July, 77, Washington did not speak French. I had to speak English to him. If you move forward to the Battle of Brandywine shortly thereafter, on September the 11th in 77, in the course of that engagement, Washington sent me into the action to try and rally a portion of the American armies that had begun to retreat under General Sullivan's division. And had I been yelling at them in French, monsieur, they might still be running today in 18. By then, Washington had more confidence in me. And he knew he was not going to give me command of anything at all unless I knew the language of command. So many of my letters are still in existence, monsieur, and you will see how I began to grasp the knowledge of the English language and the language of command. Yes, monsieur.
What do you make of the current presidential election of 1824?
Oh, indeed, monsieur, it brings to light a question that we must ask all Americans present, that of whether you shall re-elect James Monroe or elect the newly appointed John Quincy Adams. Indeed, perhaps you are not of age, young man, but who would you vote for, Monsieur Monroe or John Quincy Adams?
Mr. Adams.
Ah, I see. You must be from New England, yes? You know, I admire them both, to be sure, and whatever process or whoever you select as the American people, as long as you are obeying the process, that is what is most important, and it should be reflective of the opinion of the American people. But Monsieur Monroe, when I met him on the battlefield at Brandywine, it is interesting, as the physician was looking for the musket ball, if it was present at all within my leg, he told Monsieur Monroe to distract me in some way, shape, or form. So Monsieur Monroe began to describe the beauty of Virginia. I must admit, I didn't really care at that moment. Nonetheless, we have remained friends ever since. He spent, of course, much time in Europe as well, as did John Quincy Adams. But I say, whatever the American people choose as the best person for the post of president, who will be the best person for the job. Excellent question. Yes, mademoiselle.
When and how did you die?
Oh, goodness, I must be looking worse than I thought I did. What and where did I die? What did I die of, and where will I die? Well, mademoiselle, it is true. In my 67th year of age, here in 1824, I have seen many trials and tribulations. I have endured war in America. I have endured war in Europe. I have been imprisoned in the fortress of Olmütz from 1793 to 1797. I lost much of my fortune. I did not have a sou within my pocket at that time. I have seen the death of my beloved wife in 1807, my first child in 1777. But I have endured. So I am hopeful, mademoiselle, that God willing, I shall live to, I think it would be fitting, 76 years. Like the spirit of 76 here in America. Would you not think that is fitting? Of course, we would all like to live a bit longer, but I will take that. And how will I die? Only the good Lord above knows how that will be, but I suppose I should wear a cloak if I am out in foul weather conditions. I don't want to get cold or pneumonia or anything like that. We shall see what time has to say. Yes, madame.
Tell us about the period of the French Revolution. What happened to you?
Yes, madame asks for me to briefly speak about the French Revolution of 1789. Of course, the 14th of July is truly the beginning of the French Revolution. That is when the people of Paris will storm the Bastille. Roughly 80,000 citizens in a city of 600,000 at that time, a sizable city to be sure. And we know the revolution begins not only from the storming of the Bastille, but actually the king, Louis XVI, was out hunting, as he often did when he should have been looking to matters at home. And one of his ministers came to him with a very sour expression upon his face. And the king said, "C'est une révolte? Is it a revolt?" He said, "No, sire, c'est une révolution." "No, sire, it is a revolution." And he said that on the 14th of July, 1789. Well, of course, it would begin the storming of the Bastille. And why the Bastille? Well, the Bastille was a symbol of tyranny. It had originally been a fortress in the Middle Ages, but it had become a prison. And a prison typically not for your common criminal, but rather for your political criminals. But Voltaire spent some time simply writing against the abuses of government. So by taking the Bastille, of course, you are going to take away those abuses. I, in fact, sent a key to President Washington, of which it still resides within the foyer of Mount Vernon. that now he had that key to unlock that injustice. Yes, you thought of that, right, madam? But nonetheless, the revolution would progress, a constitutional monarchy would be put in place, but not all of the people of France were in favor of a monarchy. In fact, many wanted to go in the complete opposite direction. Committees of public safety would rise up with men like Marat, Danton, Saint-Just, and of course the most famous, Robespierre. They were in favor of abolishing the monarchy and creating a république like here in America. And it was done in August of 1792. The storming of the Tuileries, the king and queen are arrested with the royal family and they are found guilty of crimes against the state. They are sent to a new device created by a Dr. Guillotin. It's called the guillotine. We often called it the national razor. And as a result of the death of the king and queen of France, well, all of Europe declares war upon France. Because they don't want the same ideas of liberté, égalité, fraternity, liberty, equality, and brotherhood to be contagious and come to their countries. So it is there where I find myself commanding French troops, but even I, the Marquis de Lafayette, am recalled back to Paris to face a trial, of which I undoubtedly would have been sent to the guillotine. So I decided to flee France, crossing the border into Belgium, but it's there that I am arrested by the Austrians. And why did they arrest me? They arrested me because I was no longer serving a monarchy. I was now serving a république, so they felt I had betrayed my class in society. So 93 to 97, I remain in prison. Bonaparte is the one who really is responsible for my release because of his first Italian campaign of 96 and 97. And then by 99, he performs a coup d'etat and takes over the government of France. So from 99 all the way to 1815, he remains the emperor of the French. First consul, then emperor in 1804. 1815, the Battle of Waterloo is defeated, and the constitutional monarchy returns. Do it this week. So that, in a nutshell, madame, is the French Revolution. Now, my friends, I know there are others that still have some questions for me, but my aide-de-camp is telling me that I must come to an end. Now, I shall go out into the foyer of this magnificent new theatre, and I shall remain there to answer any and all questions that you might have, or if you're in want of painting a quick portrait with me. But most of all, I thank you for all coming to the debut of the performances here at the Heritage Auditorium. I certainly hope you have enjoyed yourselves, and I hope you shall enjoy yourselves for the remainder of your stay in colonial Williamsburg. Thank you all.